Thank you very much for inviting me, for having me. Indeed, it seems also like the topic of sanctions is close to your recent work, I would say, as well. And it's been around for me for a while, so you could, I guess, call it a love-hate relationship with Russia in a way. And to a certain degree, I guess I owe my career to there being these sanctions. In that sense, it's for me personally, it continues to be a worthwhile topic of study. It's also nice to be here because I was on this stage here a couple of years ago in 2017, I think, or so. I got a nice award here on another paper, and so it's just good memories for
IfW award or something.
Yes. Yeah. So in that sense, I'm very happy. So let me talk about this current piece of research. This joint work with Robert Gold, who's at the Kiel Institute, and Michele Valsecchi, who's formerly at the New Economic School in Moscow, and he's physically Boston. So I guess I don't really have to motivate this talk anymore the way that I would have had to motivate it in 2021 or up until 2021. The sanctions really are everywhere. We have those sanctions against Russia. There was this first round in 2014. Obviously, the even more potent round of sanctions since 2022. Sanctions against Iran, North Korea, embargoes. And so this is something that's a quite popular tool of foreign policy. And Gabriel, together with co-authors, has put together this nice database that actually really looks into, okay, what are these types of regimes? We see, in general, we see an upward trend of those. The number of new cases was relatively stable, and I think since then it has been increasing. So it's something that is really worth studying. At the same time, by now, I would argue that we have a relatively good understanding now of what the economic consequences of sanctions are. So trade sanctions have been extensively studied at the firm level, at macro level for various cases. We know a bit more about timing, about what's happening behind the border, so to say. So what are the domestic consequences of trade sanctions? So economic consequences are relatively well understood. But where there's a bit of a gap, I would say, is looking at the actual political impact, because you don't do sanctions because you want to just as a tool of punishment, but you want to achieve a goal with this, and there the evidence is scarce. There is a literature, and mostly political science, that looks at this, but it's often more a qualitative evaluation, which is therefore its own right, but it clearly lacks quantitative evidence, and so that's where we're looking at, and it's important to think about political consequences in the sense of one measure of the success of sanctions is, you want to change the policies of the targeted country. And how is that achieved? Well, you would think that if the population of a targeted country has at least somewhat of a say, then there should be a political backlash against the leader. And what do we see? Likely something else. Right? So Putin is as popular as his. So he's at his most popular point currently, even more popular than he was after the 2014 sanctions. And this is really across Russia. You can look at polls from approval ratings of a somewhat reliable source, the Levada Center. They've been known as somewhat objective in their polling. And so what you see is that the net approval rating of Putin always shoots up when these sanctions happened, both in 2014, but also since then in 2022. Right, so stuff is happening in Russia. There's ups and downs, and then there's a big war, and there's sanctions, and the approval rating goes up.
So is it the war?
Oh, that's a good question.
It increases the popularity, or is it sanctions? Because in 2000, when did he invade Georgia?
That was 2008.
Yeah, because that marks a point of, it's opposite, right? For 2008, popularity was going down, right?
Yes.
Oh.
That's okay. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, there were no sanctions in 2008.
Indeed, but
so maybe that's
maybe
there was a war, but no sanctions.
Maybe that helps saying that it's not the war, it's the sanctions.
Yes.
Because if it were the war, we would see an approval increase in 2008 too. No?
Yeah, and obviously, the Russian government is not just sitting idly, but they're spinning this as this was a war. They had to fight, and then now against the evil West, and now the evil West is even imposing sanctions on them. So there's obviously a lot of spin going on.
And this is approval. Most probably, this is done survey of Russians in Russia.
Yes. Yeah. By these guys here, and you can also look at the approval that has a bit more balanced. So there's net approval is the approval and disapproval goes up and down. But again, you see at the point when stuff happens. Actually, here you also see in 2008 a big spike. Actually, that's interesting. So in 2008 the approval shoots up for. And the Georgia, interesting. But the same thing here happens in 2014.
And Grozny, when was that? Chechnya?
This is earlier. This is sometime around here, I think. So this is before he became president. 99. Yeah. So he became president on January 1st, 2000. And again, so approval rating of the government shoots up in 2020. And so the question is, did the 2014 sanctions, so we're going to be looking at the 2014 sanctions because as you'll see later on that we need data, we're looking at a quantitative exercise, so we need data for what was going on. And so we look at the 2014 sanctions, and the question is, did those sanctions affect regime support? And what we're going to do, so we're going to look at local electoral outcomes and sanctions exposure. And we have data for Russian ballot box level data for 20 years. We compute a local sanctions exposure or regional sanctions exposure in some specifications. And then we estimate the effect of regional sanctions exposure on changes in voting behavior. And obviously, you're going to be asking, okay, what about elections in Russia? And I'll spend quite a bit of time on this later. And so to give you a hint of what we're going to be doing, this is the sanctions exposure of exports. So we have red denoting a big, or darker red, meaning bigger negative impact of the sanctions on overall exports, and green denoting a positive effect during that time on output. And so what you see is that there's a big east-west divide. And so in the east, this is the border to China. There was actually a positive effect of sanctions, whereas towards in the West, where you're close to Europe, that's where there's lots of trade with Europe. That's where there's a strong negative.
What was it positive? This is a general equilibrium sort of thing?
Yes. Yeah. So it's not just a change in exports, and then this is a big point that we're trying to make, but it's a gravity GE. And we relate that to Putin's vote share. So we have data for almost 100,000 electoral districts. So essentially where you go to the ballot box across all of Russia. And you see here this the share in the vote share for Putin in the 2017 election, I believe it is. And you see that there's quite a bit of variation. So the greener, the higher the percentage. But interestingly, there's also some places where he gets hardly 40%. And interestingly, so this is in the Far East. This is where the Communist Party to this day is by far the strongest party. So they sort of didn't get the memo that stuff has changed. So but we're going to be exploiting variations over time in support for Putin and in support for the Russian.
No data on Kaliningrad?
Say again?
Kaliningrad, no data there.
We have data on Kaliningrad. I don't know why it doesn't show up. Interesting one. And never noticed. Okay, but so we're going to be using the two variations in the two. So let me start with a small word on Russian data, and I'll ask you to bear with me because toward the end we're going to investigate this for a lot more. at first look, this is very rich data. So this is the website of the Russian Federal Russian Election Commission, and they have fantastic data on all results related to elections. Okay, so you can, it's quite difficult to access. So there are drop-downs, menus after drop-down menu for whatever. But for 20 years of elections, we know every federal, so election at the national level, at the regional level, at the local level, municipal level. We know who the candidates were. We know, how many votes were cast. It's in that sense, it's transparent. Quite difficult to get the data, but it's there. And so if you're interested in what happened locally, you click through those drop-down menus and you see, there were 642 votes cast. Of those, X went to this person and to other. We also know quite a bit about the candidates, actually. So we know, for example, for every candidate, we know the address of where they live at the point of the election, and we know the brand of the car for whatever reason. But it's incredibly rich data. It's quite difficult to access. We scraped the whole thing. This took a while. The server went down a couple of times. But it's very nice data. The thing is, nowadays you need a Russian IP address to access this website. So there's still ways of getting this. There are a couple of data sets, though, now openly available, not only by us, but by others, that make this data available for. So we're not the only ones to scrape this website. And so this is what it looks like. And I speak zero Russian, but I was told. So this is for some. Does anyone here speak or read?
Yeah, others can read it. Huh?
It's very small, so what do you want me to read?
So that would be the second complication for me as well. But
Yeah, so the first row is the number of voters and the number of
ballots.
so the second one is the number of voters plus the voting committee, whatever it means.
And so this is for one, this is district number 323 in, I think this is Moscow Oblast. And, there are, votes for the different candidates, one of them being Putin. And
Not a large number, 16.
That must be the
16 Vladimir Vladimirovich.
Yes. Here, this guy, right? And so, this is really super nice raw data at the very local level for 100 and something million Russian potential voters. We know really how to vote. And so obviously, I'll show you this in a moment. Obviously, someone is tinkering with the data, and this has been documented before. And we have some I'll show you some fun graphs in a moment. But this is, could this be a problem for us? I hope to convince you by the end of this talk that it's not going to be. And we can think rather here as a feature of the data for our analysis than all right, so there's been a bit of literature on this before, and obviously there's quite a bit on the economic impacts. I'll briefly talk about that. Then I'll show you how we compute this sanction exposure. Then I'll talk more about the overall effect and how we measure the sanctions and the regime support effect again. And then I'll talk a little bit about effect heterogeneity and election fraud, which is clearly there. That it doesn't matter. So there's quite a bit of work, especially in the past 2 years, on the impact of sanctions. So there's some earlier work on sanctions stuff that's happening in sanctioned economies. There's some very interesting recent work by Jamila Nigmatulina. She's in Lausanne, who shows that there was actually extensive state support for targeted Russian firms, to the extent that these were actually better off after being sanctioned on many indications. But that obviously came at the expense for the rest of the economy. So this was state spending into targeted economies. And so she shows very nicely that it hit Russia, but not in the way that it was intended. Essentially, those smart sanctions were dumbed down again by the reaction of the Russian government. And then we have a bit of work on what happens in sanctioning countries. I've also worked on this. So what's the intensive and extensive margin effect of sanctions on sanctioning sender country firms? There's some very nice work on global trade effects. And there's a little bit of work on the political impact of economic sanctions. So there's related work by Peva, who's actually by now also a colleague in Kiel, who shows that proximity to targeted firms, so voter proximity to targeted firms in Russia, so effectively she has the same data as we do, leads to a similar effect. So not only do these dumb trade sanctions sanctions that were imposed on Russia lead to electoral effects, but also targeted sanctions. And so she shows that the closer you live to a targeted firm, the more likely it is for you to vote for Putin again. We have some work on stuff that's happening in France. So if you were living close to a firm that was previously exporting a lot to Russia, and so suddenly that export market is gone, then you tend to vote more for Le Pen than before. Again, not because it's a big effect, but it's a good story in the media. And then it's also actually quite related to recent work on retaliatory tariffs. So talking about Trump tariffs again, we were this morning, but there's quite a bit of work on the Trump 1.0 tariffs and reaction to that. And it's not too unrelated. Now it's worthwhile reminding in these talks that this we're talking at a high level about the effect of sanctions, but obviously there's a reason for that, and that's there's been a war going on in Ukraine actually since 2014. This is not something that started just 2 years ago. And so for context, for the timeline, what happens is there's stuff happening in Ukraine. The Russians effectively invade Ukraine in February 2014. And that's when the West starts imposing sanctions. First, these smart sanctions, so certain travel bans, asset freezes. The situation militarily escalates further, results in downing of this Malaysian Airlines flight over eastern Ukraine in the summer of 2014. And that's when the broader economic sanctions are imposed on Russia from Western countries. And so essentially what we're going to be looking at is, what happens in Russia after these broad economic sanctions. And so what's nice for us is that from empirically speaking, there were Russian parliamentary elections and Russian presidential elections the years before, just before this happened, and there were that this happens, sanctions are imposed, and then again you have parliamentary and presidential elections right afterwards. And so we're going to be using that as a shock to see what happens in. Now, if we were to think of a sanctions shock, then lots of stuff happens in the world that can affect how trade flows affects, how in general sanctions effects are. Lots of stuff happen in the world. So what we're going to be looking at is regional variation within Russia. So sanctions exposure within Russia. We're going to be using that heterogeneity or exploiting that variation to say something about whether being more exposed to sanctions has an effect on voting behavior, on regime support. Than not being as exposed. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at changes in vote outcomes. We're going to be using that election data as a proxy for support for a regime. And we're going to be relating that to sanctions exposure and obviously controlling for quite a bit of other stuff that happens. So the left-hand side is going to be in changes. It's classic diff and diff setup. Looking at the first difference being across space, the second being over time. And we're going to be looking at parties and candidates' vote shares for the regime, for the president, but also for other parties and candidates, because obviously increases in vote share for one are at the expense of the other. We're also going to be looking at something like turnout, And then we have, as we have this long elections data, so 20 years of that, we also have gray periods. We can look at, can do placebo tests and so on to make sure that this is not something that was going over time.
So that setup is understandable. This is the way how you would have to do, but it does take out Russian-wide effects. No?
Absolutely.
So if you were to say that inflation is a problem everywhere, people don't like that, sanctions bring inflation, that will be differenced out. No?
That's true. Yes. Yeah. So this is sort of the differential effect of exposure, and that we cannot really say much about. So it's the classic intercept problem in a way. That's true. We do know, though, the change in vote share for Putin over the whole country. So we can, we can say something about the points that he gained or lost due to this. Okay. Any question on the setup? So very simple diff setup. The shock is going to be sanctions exposure, and I'm going to be spending some time on this because the challenge one in such a setting usually is, okay, how do we, what's sanctions exposure? And sure, there was some other stuff going on, but the primary channel often is thought as, the Russians cannot sell their stuff anymore, buy their stuff anymore from abroad. That's something, we're constantly looking at, does stuff go through third countries or through China now to Russia? So this seems to be, it's one of the main proxies for overall sanctions exposure. That's challenge number one. And if we just looked at that, you would see this year. So this is the observed change in exports between 2013 and 2015. So, in between this happens. And so in general, you see a somewhat similar picture where, those places in the West trading a lot with Europe, those have overall decrease in total exports, whereas, here in the Far East, this is again bordering China, you have some positive. The problem, though, is that obviously, also this is the net change in imports. Other stuff happens. So there's an oil price shock in early 2015. There's quite a bit of inflation, in part maybe driven by the sanctions, but also because, suddenly, so other stuff happens in the Russian economy, but also other stuff happens worldwide.
What are the black regions?
This is lack of data, essentially. Okay, so these, I think I saw a very nice map a couple of days ago, population density in Russia. So this was about something very different. So this was about, being a nuclear power and having essentially everyone living in just one place, Moscow.
Not very much diversification.
Exactly. But so very different topic. But the point is that you have 90% or so, or maybe it's 80% in broader Moscow region, quite a number in St. Petersburg, and then the remaining. So of the remaining 15%, 10 to 15%, a lot happens here, and very little happens over here. And so again, in these places, sometimes there's just they don't report data. Because there's just not much time. And so challenge number two is, well, we observe changes in trade, but that can be driven by something else. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using a structural model to estimate the effect that's due to the sanctions of these observed changes. And we're going to be taking the difference between the world that would have been and the world that was due to sanctions, and that is going to be essentially the sanctions-induced trade loss. We're going to be aggregating that over time, and then we call this the sanctions exposure. Yeah, this is how much sanctions made a difference in total exports of these places. And so when you do that, that's what we're going to be doing. Okay? And so how do we do this? We're going to follow some earlier work where we compute this loss rate. And I think that we had didn't we have a joint project in 2016, 2017, where we used again this same methodology to, what was the
impact of Russian sanctions on Austria?
On Austria, okay. See, so we have it for Austria, sure.
Very difficult.
But so maybe I can be actually short on how we compute this because it's just a very simple structural gravity framework. It's sort of a simplified version of the kite model, if you will, a very much simplified version. But there are GE effects, and that's going to be important. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to compute this lost trade that was generated by sanctions. And the idea is, as I said before, what would the world have looked like without sanctions? And we're going to compare that to the world where there are sanctions, and that we call reality. We have data for. I'll talk about data in a second, but it's a GE framework in the sense that if I cannot export to Germany anymore, I'm most likely going to switch to exporting some stuff to other places. There's also overall production and expenditure effects because because of these sanctions, they were massive on the Russian economy. You have. It's suddenly on average, it's got more difficult for you to export and more difficult to import. So you're going to produce a little bit less and you're going to spend a little bit less because overall the price effects were. Okay? So you have both these effects. And so we assume that the trade sanctions effect is a good proxy for. So that's one of the identifying assumptions later on. But the trade sanctions effect is a proxy for the overall sanctions effect, and that runs through this bilateral term. And that's not I guess that's not an assumption that's dramatically new. So whenever we estimate sanctions effect with the global sanctions database, implicitly we assume that the trade effect really goes through this bilateral component. Now, this bilateral component, if I guess a number of people here know structural gravity, this bilateral component is inside these guys here as well, inside the multilateral resistance terms, and that's how trade divergence actually will be featured in this model. So it's becoming more difficult to trade with Germany, so we're going to shift our exports to other countries. In this place, we have the flow from an origin to a destination at time t is governed by these structural gravity components, where O here is not only a country, but it can also be a region, a Russian region, and D is countries globally and a Russian region. And so what we have is we have 75 Russian regions for which we have trade data. We take the rest of the world. So essentially we take UN Comm Trade, we take out Russia, replace Russia with those 75 Russian regions. And so in the rest of the world, you have effectively the rest of the world, including those 37 sanctioning countries. And so that's OAD with pre-sanction and post-sanction. And the question is, what would have happened if this phi OD hadn't changed? If the bilateral frictions were just there, were the same as they were in 20 before the sanctions were imposed?
Well, there's one thing that one rules out when doing this way is that in a situation of a conflict, it's really trade costs that generate changes in observed trade flows and not preferences, because if you look at public attitudes and so on, right? So the narrative, it's the West attacks Russia, and so even with trade costs constant, you might import less because of it. It's like the freedom of rice,
yes.
The Iraq War. And that, of course, has implications for the welfare calculations, direct ones. That it's not the same, right? So if it's not trade costs, but through preferences, then we can't say much about welfare. Well, if it's trade costs, we think this is detrimental to welfare, and that people don't like that.
Yes,
preferences would be different, no?
So as long as here we don't say I mentioned trade costs, but it's actually the bilateral friction. So if there are bilateral preferences, I don't like now the Russian consumers. They don't like to buy German cars anymore, even though they were allowed to buy German cars still. That's fine. So it's part of the bilateral component.
Sure.
As soon as it's something that's, I'm so very much pro-Russian now, and I only buy Russian over everything else foreign, whether they're sanctioning or not, then that's something that will be in existence there.
But the interpretation is different. No, maybe it's in terms of what it does. For example, for welfare, it's different. If you face higher trade costs, that is making goods more expensive. It's a direct loss of efficiency.
Yeah.
If it's preferences, you decide. It's just change. We don't know when. It's hard to have a welfare economic interpretation of this with changing preferences, but the consequence. So, what you assume, and that's totally perfect, totally okay, is that the effect of sanctions go through the bilateral trade costs, but preferences could play a role, and it may be useful to preempt referees or others who might come with that question, because it's mixed up in the FI term, and empirically you load everything into trade costs.
That's true.
Well, it might be you might have in principle to decompose the FI term into a trade cost component, into bilateral preference component.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Then again, I guess that part is really not about sanctions, but it's more about, as you say, about preferences. And so, it's a good point. Maybe one could look at actually. So we're in a revise and resubmit situation here right now. So something that we're looking at is we have this for aggregate flows, but we have 6-digit HS product data for this, and so we can look at consumer products versus other products. Where I guess consumer products, you would see this. What you're saying, this preference shock. That's where the action happens, and I guess if you're just shopping for intermediates, and you may not be that interested in that. So that's something that we're exploring.
So you fix the bilateral FIs to the pre-sanctions level, but what about the Y and X, the production and expenditures? Because you take like OT and DT, but they are potentially also affected, and it's
So we assume that they are affected in the way that we're going to be imposing here by the structural model, but I'll talk about that. So what we're going to be estimating is essentially the bilateral frictions matrix from before, and you can do this by estimating. So there are different ways of doing this, and we do this in different ways in the paper, but so I'll show you one way here. The results are very similar across all specifications. Is just estimating so taking out treated untreated observation, in the sense that we estimate this on the pre-period, and then we have the average bilateral frictions from the pre-period between all country pairs and all country regions. Okay, so for the whole matrix, we just have the average frictions that were. And so these fixed effects, standard structural gravity estimation, take care of the rest, and so we can use this here as a one manifestation of the bilateral frictions from the pre-period, and then we're going to recompute. So taking observed total exports and total imports, we're going to recompute we're going to take out all the stuff that has happened between since the pre-treatment period. So we're going to effectively, what we're going to pretend is nothing has changed in bilateral frictions since the onset of the sanctions, and so 2012, 2013, and at least in terms of bilateral frictions, never happened. So the 2014 never happened. The average bilateral frictions just continue to rule trade. And this is how you recompute the bilateral. The multilateral resistance terms, and then you get these so-called conditional general equilibrium, where we essentially account for the trade diversion part, and then you get the full general equilibrium by saying, now actually overall it's gotten more difficult to export, and overall it's gotten more difficult to import, so you're going to adjust production and expenditure as well. This is borrowed from Emerson and co-authors. And so you impose a little bit more of microcausation here than we imposed before. And so then you can recompute the production and expenditure that would have been had those frictions not changed in the meantime.
But you could also run a full-fledged gravity equation, estimate the effect of the sanctions, and simulate the counterfactual of closing that sanction effect to zero.
Yeah.
Going through the Anderson-Inco iterative or whatever PPML method, whatever you like, to essentially the same.
Yeah.
Would it be perfectly isomorphic?
No. Because then we impose a sanctions effect that would have been constant over, we say, oh, here's a sanctions dummy now, and that is the same for all countries. I mean, we could make this heterogeneous and varying over time. And so the more flexibility we allow, the closer it gets to that, this specification that we have. But, if you just think of, we're estimating a sanction shock, then you're imposing an average sanction shock from sanctioning countries, identical across time and across space, which is fine, which is also actually what we're doing right now, because one of the referees asked for that. Yes, so it imposes more structure. Here we're super, stuff happens in the world economy in terms of bilateral frictions, and we just say, well, what if that hadn't happened? Okay? So that's how we compute the initial shock. And so in the paper we have at length, we discuss that, if you think about bilateral frictions between 2012, 13, 14, 15, what did happen was the one major thing that did happen were those sanctions. So actually not much is happening. You could be worrying about, maybe the Russians went to the Central Asian economies at that point and to Turkey and to China and said, look here, can we please import this stuff now? So we can take out those countries from our procedure here. We recompute everything, and yet still, the effect very much goes through. So we have a battery of robustness checks looking at the sanctions.
50 more minutes.
15? Okay, then I have to hurry a bit, as you can see. So we have data but important. So we have these counterfactual trade flows now, and that's the dashed line, okay? And so this is a plot for Russian exports to Poland, a sanctioning country, and Russian exports to Turkey, not a sanctioning country. And we compute flows for the whole trade matrix, for every trade flow between all countries in the world, and so also for those flows to Turkey. And just to give you a flavor of how good the model works, so this is the pre-sanction period, and there it should be good because this is just the average frictions that are in here, and so the dashed line is super close to the solid line. Those are the observed flows. And the blue flows are the flows to Turkey, and the red flows are the ones to Poland. And what you see is that after we let after the sanctions happen, the observed flows dramatically shift or diverge from the predicted flows for the sanctioning country, where in the prediction we impose frictions never changed. They do not diverge much at all from the flows to Turkey. So, there we also say, well, what if those frictions never change? Actually, they never really did change, and that we see here. Okay, so this works really well with just a very simple, admittedly very simple structural gravity model. I think this works extremely well. Okay, and so what the shock is going to be then is the difference between the dashed line and the solid line, and then aggregated over time. Okay, and then you get what's the relative impact of the we normalize by the flows that would have been, and so this is the sanctions exposure is the relative decline in total exports of a region to the situation where the sanctions never happened. And just to get back to this here, we have data regional trade data for those Russian regions and UN comp trade for the rest of the countries.
Julian, did you also look at imports?
Yes, we compute everything also for imports. So here, for imports, the Russians really control a lot more of what's happening, and that's why our benchmark is the export side. Yeah. Because the Russians themselves imposed an embargo on food and agricultural products, so there it's a lot more stuff that's under control by the Russians, and that's
but that would maybe be more directly related to domestic policy.
This imports. And so this is what the shock then looks like. But you see that obviously they are super correlated. that's also what it shows.
So do you have data on the national, subnational trade across regions?
No.
So there's probably a lot of diversion also happening.
Presumably there is. Yeah. One thing that we implicitly oppose is that there was not a change in frictions between regions, and then this holds. Okay, and so this is the export. This is the shock that we're going to. That's our main shock, main specification shock. Most of the imports. We also tried with some other measures for sanctions exposure, but this is what we're the main thing. Now on the election data, I already mentioned where we get the data from. It's 100,000 places across all of Russia. We have all elections, Duma, presidential, regional, local, whatever you want, since 1998. And as I mentioned, we know quite some personal detail even about the candidates. We don't make use of it here at all, but I think it speaks for what the data is. And this is what it looks like. This is turnout. So how many votes were cast out of those that were eligible votes? And you see that there's quite a bit of variation here. You also see some places where people were encouraged, let's call it that way, at least, to go vote, right? Because this is, close to 100% here turnout. And these are actually, we could impose the regional borders. This is really sort of regional thing. Either they were encouraged or there was some very explicit tinkering. This is Putin's vote share. I showed you this before, but we also have this for the other candidates. That's Grudinin. He's the communist guy. And this is the support base is the Far East.
But this is just for districts and regions where you have trade data, right?
No, these are all polling stations in all of Russia. But you see, there was this question, why do we have these gray regions here? Because there's just there's hardly anything going on. But these are 100,000 locations. This is Sobchak. She took a picture with Sarah Wagenknecht yesterday. So she's still around. Here she ran as an opposition candidate to Putin. Sure, tells you quite a bit about this. I think she's the godchild of Putin as well. So here she was an opposition candidate, and she actually gained some 20% in the hip parts of Moscow and St. Petersburg. So it's a very
light greenish,
light brown greenish dots sprinkled in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Okay, so let's get back to the main estimating equation. So, as I said before, it's a standard diff and diff. Obviously, the identification relies on a set of assumptions. So the difference in difference nets out any pre-existing difference, specialization with respect to production, expenditure, with respect to trading partners, with sort of substitution to trading partners. All of this cancels out because of the differencing. And then we control for some other stuff. So in and out migration of regions, labor market conditions, and so on. I'll show you this in a minute. What's our left-hand side variable? We look at the vote share of parties, and here parties or candidates, and so regime is going to be Putin or Medvedev. So Medvedev was the president in 2012, and Putin just coincidentally was re-elected after one term paused in 2012. United Russia is the party that supports Putin. Putin himself is not a member of that party. There are a couple of loyal parties to the Kremlin. There's a true opposition, and then you have the communists and the nationalists and a little bit of the rest. And so we group them together based on sort of the general understanding of what they are like. We have a little bit of a problem with time consistency of voting stations, and so we aggregate them at a rayon level, which is comparable to NUTS 3 in the European classification. So this is Kreis. I don't know what's the Austrian equivalent of a Bezirk. Bezirk. Okay. Yeah. So we have a couple hundred or a couple thousand of those. Okay. 4,000 here, you see. And so this is what's happening. So if you just our main specification, the baseline specification, it looks at regime support, regress that on on the export exposure, sanctions exposure. Here is this export measure, and what you see is that there is a significant positive effect of export exposure on Putin. So the more the place in Russia was exposed to sanctions, in the sense of the relative difference in exports due to the sanctions, the higher that measure was, the more the change in vote shares for Putin. So Putin overall gained, but he gained even more in places that had a higher share in higher change in sanctions exposure. Okay. Political scientists, whenever there's some in the room and I talk about this, they're like, duh, we've known this. This is called the rally around the flag. Okay, so there's there are mechanisms behind this, obviously, but this is so in qualitative analyses, this is often what is found, and we are not aware of any other study that has done this before. And with this quantitative rigor, where we can really show that exposed places have vote more for the regime than before. And you can control for various things at the very local level. So labor changes to industrial composition, to unemployment rates, to youth unemployment, to control for obviously for levels for. So it was Putin already at 90%, and there's not much that he can gain, and so on. Super robust, also in terms of how we compute the shock. And so what does this mean in the baseline? In the baseline specification, a one standard deviation standard deviation increase in the treatment leads to a change of 1.4 percentage points for Putin. And what does that mean? So this is the two political scientists, the political economists that are on this. Apparently, this is how in political economics you think about it this way. This explains so effectively 22% of the vote change in votes for Putin. So there was a general increase of 6.3% of vote share for Putin. We can explain 1.4% of that. Or I like that interpretation better. The average region's vote share of that we can explain 13% of the change. So it's not everything, obviously, but it's there.
The second implication, not actually accurate, right? The second implications you can't really draw it from a definitive, because the 22% is the aggregate increase in vote share, overall, right? So whether you base inference on differences, and so we can say something about the difference between the exposed and the less exposed region, but nothing about the overall shift, But those 22% are
6.3% of the overall shift.
Yes. So the overall.
Yes, exactly. So you can't compare it to the overall shift, can you? Because that is.
Is it this 6.3? Is it for all Russia?
Yes, it's all of Russia between the pre and post-sanction elections. That's the change in.
But if you compare this to the change in the exposed, like in the exposed group or in the treated group, not treated, but because you have continuous treatment, but.
Yeah, so that's why we need this one standard deviation increase. So to have, but I see your point, and I continue to have a difficulty with
that. That's the same mistake that was in the Otto Dorn Hansen paper. Just. Some people get very wild on this now. Not me, but some.
So it's a size. So it's significant and sizable effect. So I think this here is. No, I still can't, right? Because you're still shifting. Be careful. Now, so if there's a change in votes towards Putin, that means that it's at the expense. I'm sorry, I missed your.
What you cannot control for is vote suppression or suppression of opposition candidates, because I think in the period from before the Kremlin, the war 2014, so this increased to 2018. So and yeah, so. I think this would be.
That's a fair point. So if there was let me show you some stuff on election fraud. But this is something that yes. So if there was a market shift in where this happened, then we have a bit more of a. So that's something that we do. That's a fair point. Yes.
Wir müssen zum Ende kommen.
Ja, ich brauche noch 3 Minuten. So if there's obviously more for Putin means less for others, and it seems to be coming from the communists. So those in the Far East, they seem to get the memo. They go, at least this is where there's this old restoring the old Soviet Union. That's the same story here. Okay, there's nothing happening really on turnout, which is also interesting. We have some various placebos studies, alternative measures. Now let me say a thing about heterogeneity. This is across the board. We can cut the data the way we want. So those regions that traded a lot with strong ties to Ukraine, because it could be driving it's just a war effect. It's not. Oil and gas exporters, it's really not. Right. So there's no significant differences between how you split the data. It's just the sanctioned firms as the one that PEVA finds. So if you live close to a targeted firm, is that just driving the results? No, we can just we can control for the number of targeted firms in a place. It doesn't change much. Is it just driven by those regions close to China that they're living their life, have the time of their life because now suddenly there's stuff happening and they're rejecting Putin and realizing the world out there is great and we can trade a lot with them? No, right? We can get rid of them. It's not driven by either the extremes. Election fraud. But you need a good resolution protector here because what you see is this is a very nice distribution of turnout. There are spikes. There are spikes at exactly 70%, 80, 75, 80, 85, 100. Okay, it's up here. So it's smooth except for the nice numbers. And this is taking out the obvious nice numbers. So there are a couple of districts where it's not exactly 100 votes, exactly 120 votes or so on. So taking out all those where the nice numbers are more likely still happens, right? And the same thing for a vote share for Putin, 100, 95, 90, 85, right? So it's a smooth distribution except for those places. It doesn't happen for Grudinin, the communist. It doesn't happen for the hipster candidate. Right. So let me get back to this map and let me superimpose the locations where this happened, where we have the nice numbers. There are other ways to think about election fraud, but this is very, very, I think, very nice to share this. So to show this. So there are quite a number of places across all of Russia. And so what we do again is we can regress the shock on the likelihood that this happens in a place. And what we see is that this is not happening. It's not that there's more election fraud suddenly in places where there are strong sanctions. So this happens, but it also happened before. And it's not like this is suddenly happening in places that have the strong sanctions. So to come back to finish, economic sanctions have economic effects. We know that. But they don't necessarily change minds. Okay, so there really seems to be a rally around the flag effect. Due to the sanctions, people vote more for Putin, have a stronger regime support than